Well, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity again of being able to share with you a little bit on Christian history. I look at my presentation number here, and this is presentation number 11. It shows how many times we've shared with you over the last few years, and so it's always a wonderful opportunity to be able to continue to bring you the names and the lives of many of these people who have stood the test of being able to stand up and be counted for the gospel. And today I'd like to share with you the life of a man who was seen by historians not only as the first systematic theologian of the Protestant Reformation, but an intellectual leader of the German Reformation and an influential designer of their educational systems. He was to stand next to Luther and John Calvin as a reformer, a theologian and a moulder of Protestantism. He was also to stand on the dividing line between the Middle Ages and the coming of the so-called modern era. Author James Richards believed that this reformer was not only to witness these changes, but it acted a very large part in affecting one of the mightiest revolutions in culture and one of the most beneficial reformations of religion that the Christian world had ever known up until that time. Along with Luther, he was seen to be one of the primary founders of Lutheranism, with both these men rejecting many of the beliefs of the medieval church. Now, he was born Philipp Schwarzerd, but we know him better as Philipp Melanchthon. He lived from 1497 through to 1560. He's often been referred to as the scholar of the Reformation. Now, this man, who was to play such an important role in the religious and educational life of the 16th century, was born at a place called Bretten in Baden, Germany on February 16, 1497, to George and Barbara Schwarzerd. His father had achieved the distinction of being an armourer to many of the rulers at that time, but particularly to Philip the Upright, who was the Count Palatine of the Rhine. Sadly, many years later, in 1689, their original home, along with almost the whole city of Bretten, was burned to the ground by French troops during the War of the Palatinate Succession. It was not until 1897, 200 years later, that the town was to build a museum on the site of the family home to be called Melanchthon House, in memory of this very important reformer. In 1507, at the age of 10, Philip was sent to the Latin school at Pforzheim, where he received instruction in Greek and was introduced to the Greek and Latin poets as well as to the works of the philosopher Aristotle. In 1508, when he was only 11 years of age, both his grandfather and father died within 11 days of each other. And as a consequence of this tragedy, both he and his brother were brought to live with his maternal grandmother, Elizabeth Reuter, who was to supervise his education. And it so happened that she was the sister to Johann Reuchlin, a Renaissance humanist, who was later to greatly influence the boy's education while at the school at Pforzheim. It was also Reuchlin who suggested that Philip follow a custom common among humanists and change his surname from Schwarzerd, that literally meant black earth in German, into the Greek equivalent, Melanchthon. At age 12, the boy presented himself at the University of Heidelberg for admittance, where he was to study philosophy, rhetoric, astronomy, and where he became well known as a Greek scholar. Remember, he's age 12. After 2 years of earnest study at the university, he was to receive a Bachelor of Arts degree. He was not yet 15 years of age, and ever wanting to learn more, he applied for entrance as a candidate for the master's degree, but his application was denied, and it wasn't because he lacked the strength of intellect and learning. It was on the grounds that he looked too young. Not to be deterred, he applied to enter the University of Tübingen, where he was accepted in 1512 to further his humanistic studies. And while there, he worked in the area of mathematics, jurisprudence, medicine, and was taught the technical aspects of astrology by the well-known professor Johannes Stoffler. He was to attain his much coveted master's degree in 1516 at the age of 17, and under the influence of humanists such as Desiderius Erasmus and his great uncle Johann Reuchlin, he began to study theology. Now, under these men, he became convinced that true Christianity was something very different from the scholastic theology as taught at the university. And as a result, he became what they call a conventor, or repentant, and began to instruct the younger scholars in Reformation theology. Melanchthon was no ordinary man, and been described by Erasmus in the following statement. He said this: "What promise does not that youth, or boy as we might term him, Philipp Melanchthon, hold out? He's about equally eminent in Latin and Greek. What acuteness in argument, what quickness of invention, what purity of diction, what modesty and gracefulness of behaviour, and what a princely mind." Now, that's not a bad reference for anybody. And while this comment gives us some idea of his abilities, what is said of his personal appearance? Well, the verdict would seem to be less favourable. He was often described as little of stature, insignificant and boyish, of delicate frame, a frail body, awkward, and a stammerer. Luther once described him as a scrawny shrimp. And this tells us, we should never judge on the basis of outward appearances. Should never judge on the basis of outward appearances. Opposed as a reformer by his peers at the University of Tübingen because of his Reformation beliefs, he accepted a call from Martin Luther to the University of Wittenberg, where he became a professor of Greek. Now, this appointment was on the recommendation of his great uncle, Johann Reuchlin. He's now 21 years of age. On his arrival at the university, there was a general concern that he would never measure up to his responsibilities. However, his opening address as Professor of Greek was to dispel any doubts as to his ability. Luther was reported to have said that we quickly retracted the opinion which we had formed when we first saw him. People from all walks of life now flocked to his lecture room to hear him. When he first came to the university, enrolment was said to be approximately 120 students. But 2 years later, it was recorded that 600 were attending his lectures, his classes, and some records tell of 2,000 listening to his talks. Those who came were to describe him as warm-hearted, generous, thoughtful, with clear eyes and a high forehead, judicial and calm, a man having comprehension, vision, and a profundity of scholarship. It was to be after 1 year after his call, and following on from his lectures based on the book of Matthew and the Epistle to the Romans, that he received a Bachelor of Theology from the university and was transferred to the theological faculty. Now, the year was 1519, and he's now only 22 years of age. During that same year, in 1519, Melanchthon was present as a spectator at what they called the Disputation of Leipzig, where Luther, in a public debate, faced off against Johannes Eck at the Pleisenberg Castle. Eck was known as the master defender of the Catholic faith from the Jesuit University at Ingolstadt, and Luther was there to defend his 95 theses that placed sola scriptura as the centrepiece and basis of his Christian belief. Now, Melanchthon, always ready to defend Luther, was to influence the discussion by his many comments and suggestions, giving Eck an excuse to also attack him while continuing his opposition to Luther. And Melanchthon later responded with a booklet that he entitled The Defence Against Johannes Eck. As a result of this debate, Pope Leo X was to censor and threaten Luther with excommunication in his 1520 papal bull. And this was an order that was to ban Luther's views from being preached or written. On August 18, 1520, Philipp married Katharina Krapp, daughter of the esteemed mayor of Wittenberg. Originally determined to live his life as a bachelor, so he could dedicate his life to research and teaching. He was persuaded by Luther to commit to this marriage, and then he remained a strong supporter of it. It proved to be a very happy marriage, with Katharina providing strong physical and emotional support, particularly during those times when he faced opposition from other reformers over his work. He was never in good health and only managed to complete his work as a result of his extreme regularity and temperance. He set no great value on money or possessions, with his liberality and hospitality often misused in such a way that managing the household was at times found to be very difficult. They had 4 children: Anna, Philip, George and Magdalene. And it's recorded that he called his home a little church of God. Wouldn't it be wonderful if our homes could be called that? Because he always found peace there, and it was where he showed a tender love and concern for his wife and for his children. Melanchthon has not only been termed the second greatest humanist after Erasmus, but Europe's greatest linguist, as well as Germany's most illustrious scholar and teacher. He sought to know everything and sought to be master in every science. You know, we need to be ever grateful today that he regarded theology as the crown of all the sciences and chose this area of study to be his major focus. During the time that Luther was hiding out in the Wartburg Castle, translating the New Testament into German, Melanchthon wrote a document confirming and expanding many of the Reformation ideas known as loci communes, or theological commonplaces. Now, this publication mainly originated from his lectures on the book of Romans. His purpose was not to give a systematic exposition of the Christian faith, but to provide a key to the right understanding of Scripture. It was seen to be the first comprehensive presentation of Protestant doctrine up until that time. The year was 1521. He's now only 24 years of age. As Melanchthon and Luther worked together on behalf of the Reformation after Luther's return from the Wartburg, it became somewhat of a father-son relationship, with the son charming the father with his superior learning and gentle manners, and the father filling the son with wonder and reverence at his heroism and courage. Melanchthon said he would rather die than to be separated from Luther, and made clear that his friend's welfare was dearer to him than his own life. It was believed that both men sensed that God's providence had a special mission for them to complete together, even though they were very different from each other. Martin Luther once wrote this. He said, "I prefer the books of Master Philippus to my own. I am rough, stormy, and altogether warlike." So if you've read anything about Luther, that's a good description. He said, "I'm here to fight innumerable monsters and devils. I must remove all stumps and stones, cut away the thistles and the thorns, and clear the wild forest. But Master Philippus comes along softly and gently, sowing and watering with joy, according to the gifts which God has abundantly bestowed upon him." You know, it has been said that while Luther was able to bring the Reformation to the common people, Melanchthon's quiet scholarship brought the Reformation to the scholars. However, while Melanchthon won support because of his high scholarship and logical presentation of arguments that were softened by moderation and sincerity, we are told he was never ordained. Yet as a theologian, he holds an honoured place in Reformation history, often beginning his work at 2 o'clock in the morning. Now there's a bit of a challenge for you. His many friends were to despair of his health, as he ceaselessly worked day and night to supply the need for religious literature. And along with preparing the first edition of Luther's New Testament, he also wrote a guide in 1528 filled with wisdom and a liberal spirit, written especially for all the German pastors. Because of his father's dying request for his family to never leave the church, we're talking about the medieval church, Melanchthon struggled with this issue more than Luther, and he stood toward the history of the church in an attitude of piety and reverence that made it more difficult for him to accept the impossibility of any form of reconciliation. However, he was later to oppose many of the basic teachings of the medieval church, particularly denouncing the exaggerated cult of the saints and the coercion of the conscience in the sacrament of penance that involved confession and absolution to a priest. He also believed that the Bible, rather than the papacy, was to be man's spiritual guide. He believed that both the bread and the wine should be given to the laity. He believed that celibacy should not be enjoined upon the priesthood. He believed that the Mass should be abolished because it destroyed the souls of men. And he believed that man is justified by faith, not by works. However, it was to be at the Diet of Augsburg in 1530 that Melanchthon made his strongest mark, and it was seen as the greatest gift to the Reformation. This meeting, called by Emperor Charles V, after hearing Luther's ideas presented in earlier forums, now requesting an orderly presentation of the Reformers' position. In response to this invitation, Melanchthon wrote the Augsburg Confession, which even today forms the classical doctrinal statement or creed of the Lutheran Church. Some would even consider it to be the most significant document of the Protestant Reformation. He spared no effort to make this monumental production because it was to be read before the Emperor and his representatives. Of the 28 articles of the Lutheran faith, the first 21 confirm the foundations of Lutheranism, while the last 7 pinpoint the major differences between Lutheranism and the Catholic Church. At least 5 officials and 2 city representatives gave their written approval and acceptance, while the Emperor was said to explain this. He said, "Would that such a doctrine were preached throughout the whole world." You know, Johann Eck had once given assurance to Duke William of Bavaria that the belief of the Lutherans could easily be refuted, but he was now asked, "How is it now?" Well, Eck is said to have replied, with the fathers, that's talking about the traditional fathers, it could be done, but not with the scriptures. And the Duke was recorded as saying that now I understand that the Lutherans stand on the scriptures and we Catholics outside of them. You know, it's interesting to note that in the original draft of the Augsburg Confession, before it underwent many changes, Melanchthon made mention of the power claimed by the Church to introduce ceremonies, fast days, and holy days. And he specifically referred to the authority the Catholic Church took to itself to change the Sabbath to Sunday. Now, he suggested that no example is held so high and vaunted so much as the change of the Sabbath, and wished therewith to maintain the significance of the power of the Church because it has tampered with the 10 Commandments and changed something therein. Now, Martin Luther once said, if this guy does not hush up about the importance of the seventh-day Sabbath, we'll all be obliged to keep it. However, Melanchthon took the position that Sunday should be kept for the sake of expediency so that church order might be maintained. So we need to recognise, way back then, the challenges that he was bringing forward. By 1541, while the Catholic Church believed that Germany was now lost to its power and influence, war was still to break out between the German Protestant princes and the Church. And this almost ruined the chances of Protestantism to survive. During these conflicts, it could have torn the German Protestants apart. Melanchthon stood loyally by Luther's side. When Wittenberg eventually fell into enemy hands, Melanchthon's family were then forced to move from place to place until peace returned to their land. After Luther's death in 1546, Melanchthon became his natural successor, but his quiet conciliatory spirit did not have Luther's force and power. However, he carried on as leader for the next 14 years until his death from a severe cold on 19th of April 1560. A few days before his death, he committed in writing his reasons for not fearing it. He wrote that he would be both delivered from further sins. Well, that's a nice thought, isn't it? And be freed from the acrimony and fury of theologians, which were a pain in his side. He was also looking forward to seeing God and his son Jesus, and to learn about those wonderful mysteries about which he had not been able to understand during his life. As death drew near, he was asked whether there was anything that he needed, and this was his reply: nothing but heaven. His body was to be buried beside Luther in the castle church in Wittenberg, and I remember standing beside that place. And it was just an interesting feeling. Luther was just across the way, and to stand there knowing that the bodies of those men rested in that place. The only care that occupied Melanchthon's last moments was the desolate condition of the church, but he strengthened himself in almost uninterrupted prayer and listening to passages of Scripture. One of his great achievements, apart from theology and his status as a professor of Greek at the University of Wittenberg, where he served for 42 years, was to be in the area of education. Very few schools, such as the famous university preparatory schools, were to be established or new educational leaders appointed without his counsel. He found time to produce textbooks covering practically every subject taught in the schools, and along with other endeavours, this work established him as the founder of the Protestant school system in Germany and well beyond. And as such, he became known as the preceptor of Germany. What is generally not known is his important contribution to the development of Protestant church music. He wrote many hymns that were taken up and printed in the first Protestant hymnals. However, Melanchthon's importance to the Reformation lay essentially in the fact that he systematised Luther's ideas, defended them in public, and made them the basis of a religious education. While it is said that Luther scattered the sparks among the people, Melanchthon, by his humanistic studies, won the sympathy of educated people, scholars, for the Reformation. Along with Luther's strength of faith, Melanchthon's many-sidedness and calmness, as well as his temperance and his love of peace, allowed him to share in the success of the movement. He was loved by his friends and respected by his enemies, of which he had many, and he aptly wears that title, the scholar of the Reformation. We often think of Luther only. Luther would not have been Luther without Melanchthon. He's the man behind a lot of the work that was being done. Luther was the brash, bold, outspoken man that was able to put it out there, and we needed him to do that. But behind the scenes was this man working quietly and getting it all together, producing some of the best that we have of what the Protestant Reformation was really all about. Well, God bless you all. Hopefully that's been of interest. May give you a bit more of a background to that period of history.